Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Google Hangout on Air Educator Innovator webinar. Today is Tuesday, September 23rd. My name is Paul O, and I'm your host here in Berkeley, California. Today we'll be talking about the Media Activism and Participatory Politics project, also known as MAPP, and have with us a great array of guests. They are, in fact, Liana Gamber-Thompson, Sangeeta Shrestova, Michelle is not here with us at the moment, Paul Richardson, Sarah Beth Leach, and Gabe, and I apologize, Gabe, I'm spacing on your last name, I'm sorry.
That's okay, Peters-Lazaro, hey.
Peters-Lazaro, yes, thank you so much. Yes, I apologize. So one more thing before we get started, if you're watching the Hangout on Air from the Educator Innovator blog page, we do have a chat that accompanies the Hangout on Air window, and so please join that chat, and if you pose questions for our guests, we'll make sure to get them to our guests here in the Hangout, and we'll try and respond to those questions as best we can. So I actually would love for you all, I gave a brief introduction, but I would love for you all to introduce yourselves more fully. And let's go from my left to right on the screen. So Liana and Gabe, could you introduce yourselves first, please?
Sure. Who's first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
My name is Liana Gamber-Thompson, and I'm a postdoc here at USC working with the Media Activism and Participatory research team, as Paul said. And I actually did a case study on libertarian youth for a book we're writing called By Any Media Necessary. And we've been working hard the last year and a half or so on developing a platform, or not developing the platform, but developing a set of resources on a platform called Scalar. So we're excited to share that with you. And Gabe and I traveled to Portland over the summer, and Gabe also traveled to Kansas City, where we got to meet some of the great folks in the Hangout. So we'll reserve that, I guess, for later.
All right. Hey, I'm Gabriel Peters-Lazaro, and I work here at USC, University of Southern California. I'm in the School of Cinematic Arts in the Media Arts and Practice division, where I'm an instructor, staff person, and PhD candidate. And I've been working on the Media Activism and Participatory Politics project for about a year and a half now, I think, on the project that Liana just mentioned, and working on educational and outreach resources that translate the larger research of the team into interventions that can go out into the community. With a focus on media making, storytelling, civic imagination, and participatory politics. And currently you're actually teaching a class with Sangeeta here in the Media Arts and Practice division around some of that work. Maybe we'll get to talk about that later too, and excited to be here and to talk to y'all.
Fantastic. Thanks, you too. So let's go now to Paul.
Sorry, I had to mute myself. I was one with the barking dogs. Sorry. So I'm Paul Richardson, and I'm an English teacher at Washington High School. Have been since 2005. Recently, well, in the last 3 years, I've been organizing Louder Than a Bomb, which is a youth poetry festival that originated up in Chicago, and it's going into its 14th year. And it has, among other things, the purpose of bringing kids from otherwise disparate neighborhoods together for this purpose of storytelling, praising each other, getting to know each other. It's kind of a culmination of a year-round work of community organizing. And after we celebrated our first poetry festival in March of this year, I started to think that we could do that in other places and other genres as well. And so I'm opening up a nonprofit next year called the KC Word Shop, and it's going to be a place where kids can get together to share stories for poetry and also in publishing books and creating film, and just bring back art into language arts, I suppose. And yeah, so that's kind of my form of activism is teaching. So, thank you.
Fantastic. And just to clarify, you're in Kansas City, right?
I am in Kansas City, yeah,
right.
Sorry.
Great. No, not a problem. I just want to make sure our audience knew. Sangeeta, you're up next.
Oh, that's funny. I didn't realize I show up next on your window. Hi, everyone. My name is Sangeeta, and I work with Leanna and Gabe, so I'm also based at the University of Southern California. I am the program director on the MAPP project, so I work very closely with Henry Jenkins, who's our PI and Valiant leader, and I will share more about the project later, but I'm really excited to be here. Over the summer, I was lucky enough to go with Gabe to Kansas City, so I actually met Paul in person.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sangeeta. And Sarah Beth, you're next.
So I am Sarah Beth Leach. I am a language arts teacher in Portland, Oregon, where I got to meet Leanna and Gabe this summer. And I got really geeked out on the project you guys are doing because I'm also been a journalism advisor. And I like working with teachers locally and nationally on youth culture and that idea of how to get youth voice into the classroom and what that looks like for our communities when we study identity and practice storytelling and all the different ways that that can be awesome for kids and for our communities. So I think what you guys have going on is great, and I am very fortunate to be a part of this conversation.
Well, we're fortunate to have you here, Sarah Beth, and let me just point out to everyone that you are the dedicated teacher who's still at school.
Yes. No.
Clearly. Well, thanks. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for being here. I wanted to jump in by saying that, or by asking Sangeeta if she'd be willing to tell us a little bit more about the MAPP work, as she promised she would in her intro.
Right, we outlined it that way. So, so I will jump in. I thought what I would do is give a little bit of the origin story of MAPP, because I know that we all know about MAPP, but for the benefit of people who maybe don't know where MAPP came from, it might be helpful to kind of get a sense of what we did in the past to get us where we're at, which is what we'll be talking about today. So Henry Jenkins, who I mentioned in my brief intro, is a scholar who has focused a lot during his career on popular culture, on participatory culture, and media. So he's kind of, you know, I guess in his space, a guru of sorts around media studies. And about 5 years ago, when he moved to USC, he was very interested in pivoting some of the work that he'd done, which had really focused on how people use media, and seeing how that applied to changing political cultures in the US and in other places, but predominantly in the US. And just to also mention, he was coming in with work that he'd done in the space called, what he'd called new media literacies. So even though we hadn't necessarily come in from an education side, he had come working on this project around how media literacies in the classroom are changing. So kind of bring all these areas together. When I joined him, I guess 4 years ago now, it's crazy, I guess almost 4.5 years ago, we initially embarked on a path that led us into research, into really getting a sense of what's going on in the ground, how young people are using new media, and how they're bridging between cultural and political spaces. To further contextualize that, this whole effort that we went into was actually part of a larger network, which is called the Youth and Participatory Politics Network, which really grapples with the changing face of politics. So people may have heard, you know, this sort of rhetoric around, oh, young people are slack off. They engage online. They don't really engage in real ways. Or young people are apathetic. They don't care about politics. And our view is, well, maybe our definitions of what it means to take action and what it means to be politically active are no longer applicable, or maybe they've changed, and we need to really understand what young people are thinking and what they're doing. So with that, on our end, we embarked on 5 in-depth case studies that took us several years. In fact, came on board, she mentioned that she did the libertarian case study, and that's the one that we focused on. We looked at the Harry Potter Alliance, which is a group that's very close to our heart, which is a group that takes the Harry Potter stories and finds real-world applications for the narratives. So an example would be the enslavement of the house elves, and thinking about modern-day child labor or slavery. I led a case study on American Muslim youth. We looked at invisible children, and we looked at young people who've mobilized for the DREAM Act in the past few years. And coming out of all of that research, as we were synthesizing it all, as we were starting to write our book, which we just finished this summer, we realized that we were really in a position where, number one, we had learned a lot. We still had a lot to learn, but we also had a lot of connections. We were seeing connections across groups because we had looked at such disparate communities that really may not meet on an everyday basis in some point, and we felt like we really had the opportunity to encourage dialogue, to sort of pivot towards application, which is maybe a little unusual for some of us as researchers. We're used to researching, writing up, and moving on, but we really felt that in this case it really merited that pivot. So over the past 2 years, we have taken it upon ourselves to really think about how we can also use what we've learned, the connections we have, to really start to shift and do some more outreach work, encourage further dialogues, put people together, create some resources that may be useful for educators, and really get that out into, I would say, like the real world where it can be used. So as we were doing that, we realized that we wantable that people could use, that people could draw upon, and that's how we came upon this idea of developing what we're calling the By Any Media Necessary resource on a platform called Scalar. By Any Media Necessary is actually the name of our book. It's also the name of the project. It's something that we believe is really our response to what people have called Twitter revolutions, because we don't believe in sort of platform-specific actions. We believe that young people are agents, and older people, all people, are agents their media in a way that makes sense to them, and we want to support those kinds of uses. So I'm actually going to pause there and see if there are any questions at this point before we continue, because this is kind of a dialogue too, right? So feel free to ask me questions about any part of that.
One question that I have, Sangeeta, is that I know that you as well have developed, or your team has developed, workshops. So how do the workshops fit into this? Are they all specifically about Scalar, or do they vary in terms of what you're trying to cover and what it is that you're trying to talk with other educators about?
So Gabe is going to provide some overview of what we've actually put resource, the platform that lives on it's a specific platform called Scalars, where all our resources live, and Gabe is going to talk about that. But I will say that the workshop specifically grew out of partnerships with groups we worked with, where we found that these groups really had practices that could be useful to others, and that they had developed sort of almost a best practices toolkit that they were kind of applying in their cases, but oftentimes they weren't abstracting it from their specific use. So they were using it, let's say the Harry Potter Alliance had this really great way of approaching fiction for real-world change, but they were always applying it to their specific context and not necessarily abstracting out those practices so that anybody could use those. So we have been partnering with 4 to 5 of those organizations to really develop short workshops that would allow that kind of abstracting and application to happen. But I think with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Gabe so he can talk about the Scalar resource and what specifically is in it, because I think that might clarify some of the applications that we see for it.
Sure. So I'm going to switch over and start sharing my screen so you can start to see what we're talking about. So right now, you're going to see something that's definitely like a preview version. It's sort of like a pre-beta of this resource. It does exist in a publicly accessible form, though, so if you are so inclined, you can go and check it out at byanymedia.org. So we've been using an online publishing platform for digital scholarship called Scalar. That's being developed in part right here in Media Arts and Practice at USC with funding from Mellon. And I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough of what's there. Again, what you're seeing now is something that hasn't been really styled yet. It's still a little bit raw in its formatting, but in terms of the content, it's pretty close to what we imagine sharing as a resource. So I can start to give a sense of what's there and how we imagine that it might be used. Because this is part of what we want to have a conversation around. We imagine this being useful to educators, community activists, etc. So, here in a context with other educators, we really do want to talk about how it might work. That's what we've been doing with Paul and Sarah Beth and the workshops in Portland and Kansas City. So to give context to that conversation, we wanted to show you what this is and what's there. So I'll just walk through it really quickly. I'm not going to give an exhaustive, but so you get a sense of the scope and the intent. You're seeing the welcome page right now, where you get a brief description of the various branches of the project. Scalar has a organizational structure based on paths that organize the content, and you can see them visually and spatially, which is kind of a cool feature of the project. But you'll see that in part, other than information about the project and a guide to actually using the interface, we have a companion to the book project that's coming out that Sangeeta mentioned. And the ones I want to focus on are featured individuals, groups, and organizations, and the media library, the workshops, conversation starters, and digital media toolkit, kind of in the order I just rattled them off rather than the order that they appear here on the list. We try to frame the content around questions so that as you arrive here at the portal, you can sort of get directed towards what you're looking for and what's going to be most useful to you. You can also navigate through this drop-down menu, which is what I tend to do. So if we start looking at featured groups and organizations, this is a tightly curated pathway through the content. One of the first sort of inspirations for this project was coming out of the book project. There was all of this great media associated with the research, and one of our first goals was just to archive and make visible and accessible all of that great media, because it's such an important part, obviously, of the groups that were being studied. So when you go through the featured groups and organizations, you'll see a set of curated pathways that give you a really guided tour through that media based around the organization type, the civic issue being addressed, the participatory practice, or just a list of all of the individuals, groups, and organizations. So I'll just click through to civic issue, for example, and you'll see we get then another subset of civic issues. So all and ethnicity, and then we get sort of a brief, introduction to what we mean, and then groups, organizations, or individuals that engage with this civic issue. So we could look at the Dreamers, which has been an important site of inquiry and research, this movement, and landing on that page, we would get a description of the Dreamers movement, and then we would get a tightly curated subset of media. So this wouldn't necessarily be all of the media associated with this group or this movement, but it would give you a great introduction to start to understand what that's all about. The other sort of piece to that then would be to jump over and look at the media library, which is imagined as a less curated way through the media. It does still have some organizational structure to it, so we can still browse by practice, issue, media type, and just the whole media library, but larger sets of media. So whereas the featured groups and organizations pathway is meant to really sort of guide you through it, when you're looking at the media library, we imagine it as something that you would sort of be more open to discovery, so that you'll see much larger sets of content where you're really sort of doing your own exploration through the media and then discovering issues or organizations or storytelling practices, media making practices that really resonate for you, your purposes that might inspire further research. All of the branches of Scalar are really meant to sort of intersect and cross, so that if you jump through the project, you can always go further and learn more. So that's the media library. From there, I do want to talk really quickly about conversation starters, because we realize that bringing these sorts of media resources and practices into the classroom, for some educators, for some communities, that might be a whole new process. Started as a place where you can find some videos that address sort of like high-level issues that you might need to keep in mind and have conversations around when thinking about bringing these sorts of practices and media objects into different contexts, different areas. So we have a video series there that was produced in partnership with Hit Record and Pivot. I'm not going to talk too much more about that right now, but there's some interesting stuff there to kind of give you the lay of the land. And then another sort of piece branching off of that would be the Digital Media Toolkit, which is a less developed branch right now. But we imagine this being a set of practical, sort of foundational resources that would give you some sort of introductory tools to the sorts of practices in terms of media making and media literacy that would support sort of attempting to model the sorts of work that are highlighted and shown throughout the project, and that are specifically highlighted in our workshops. So that's the next, and I think maybe the last branch I'm going to focus on, because we already sort of started to talk about the workshops. Development of the workshops actually predated a flat version of the Scalar project, where we were working with groups with whom we had a relationship and were forming new relationships to really think about sort of creative storytelling, participatory practices, and how to spread those through different communities that may or may not have already been involved in those particular practices. So we started developing workshops and then wanted to really find a way to bring those workshops here into the digital space. So we've been teaming with other organizations and individuals, as Sangeeta said, to sort of adapt some of their successful practices into shareable workshops that can spread those practices to others that are interested in them. So right now we have 4 sort of model workshops on there: Think Critically, Act Creatively, Not Your Mama's Sex Ed, Who's Public, and Imagine Better, each which really engage with media and participatory politics in really different, diverse, and fascinating ways. So that's mostly what I wanted to talk about. There's so much more there that we could sort of come to it in dialogue, but I think I'll stop there so as not to monopolize too much. Yeah.
Well, that was a very nice, quick overview of Scalar, Gabe, so thank you. And now that we've kind of done the overview of Scalar, which I want to remind people again is available publicly at byanymedia.org, so go check out the resources as they are right now. But now that we've kind of given you that overview of Scalar, I want to help us take a step back and say that there are these overarching questions that kind of inform the resources that we've built on Scalar. And those include sort of why is peer-based learning important? Why is it important to bring media production into the classroom or to draw on popular culture? These are all kinds of the kinds of questions that we were thinking about when we added the material to Scalar. And I think for today, and I know that Sarah Beth and Paul can probably talk about their experiences with Scalar specifically, but I think it would be nice to have a conversation also about these broader issues and perhaps even about some of the obstacles for implementing those types of things in the classroom. So I'll turn it over to Paul now, I think, who's going to frame the questions for us. But we're going to take a step back, a step up, and focus on these perhaps more theoretical questions now.
Great, thanks, Leanna. Yeah, and so I think you've really gotten us started well, and we'd love to hear from Sarah Beth and Paul, get their perspective in this conversation. And I think if we could focus on this question of the importance of integrating peer-based learning, media production, popular culture, storytelling into your classroom spaces, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
I guess I can start. I think that question is absolutely essential, to what education is about. This generation is immersed in technology and dialogue and media, and they need to know how to sort of process it all. And so opening up the ability to tell stories or analyze information or reason with other people about, you know, why do we make media? Why is culture popular? And really practice some of the skills to not just, you know, cipher through it or try to make sense of it, but actually create it for themselves. It allows them to practice the skills and then build trust in their community, that they have a voice that's worth listening to, and taking advantage of the structure and support of a school system and a classroom where there's safety and exploration and revision, I think allows them to be able to take it out into the larger world and have confidence in it. And so whether that's peer projects, whether that's, you know, making little videos and getting a critique in the safety of their peers, I just think that this whole process is really important for students to understand what it means to be heard and then what it means to listen and give feedback. So I like the project because I think it models that for teenagers.
Great, thanks, Sarah Beth. And I'm wondering if Paul would like to add his thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, everything that Sarah Beth said, I think you can kind of hear an English teacher. The only thing I mean, I don't know what all I would add to that. There's so many realms of that conversation for what storytelling and new media does for this classroom, for any kind of classroom, particularly an English classroom. I think we can't really underestimate or even fathom what the difference and the opportunities that are involved with having this communication network called the internet, you know, where 20 years ago when I was in high school, you know, thinking about a research project was a totally different endeavor. It was going to some catalog that hopefully your library had access to, these magazines that were 7 years old, and so this idea of how quickly we can communicate with somebody on the other side of the globe, like what is that? That changes everything. That changes everything we thought about education since, you know, the beginning of time, really. You know, it's like, or civilization anyway. And you know, to further to add on to what Sarah Beth said about this. You know, being in front of your peers, and instead of writing something for the old man at the front of the classroom to read, you're now writing for this very easily accessed audience. And with Louder Than a Bomb, this poetry competition, there was some philosophy that came along with it that the folks up in Chicago put together, and it talks about rites of passage and how rites of passage are missing from Western culture. And that you know, in so many words, you know, young people need a place, a community, and whether that community is your home or it's your city or it's your classroom, young people need a place to be honored and praised for what they've been through. And these very easily accessed channels of communication, where your stories can be published and broadcast, and you can gain feedback from them, or you can receive applause for them, or whatever. The impact of that, you know, this West African author, Malidoma Some, says it's very simple. All a kid needs is a place to be praised and seen for what he or she has been through, and the impact of that is transformational. And yeah, it's necessary in my classroom, like more so than ACT prep, actually. So, yeah, so I love this work.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think that's really interesting, this point that you make, and I think Sarah Beth was alluding to it too, this notion of community. I think I guess I would add to the idea of community that it should also be a place where young people can produce and be in conversation about the things that they've created. You know, I think a lot about, for instance, the Minecraft communities that have just spawned organically, and the extent to which so many young people just gravitate to those spaces. And I think a lot of that has to do with much of what you're saying, coupled with this ability to create and to build and to share what it is that they've created with one another. I wanted to then ask you to, and I would love to hear from the rest of the MAPP team as well, in relation to any of these questions. So what have been the challenges or the ways in which you've been successful in integrating those elements into your practices? And in doing so, to what extent do you think you've been able to empower your young people?
The challenge is, I would say that sometimes the structure of our system doesn't allow for as much openness as you need to really create a dialogue. For example, I'm at a new school this year, and YouTube, there's hardly anything that I can pull up that isn't censored, whether it's a song that I wanted to show them or a spoken word piece that I was excited about, and it says it's blocked. And I was like, well, that's interesting. I haven't been exposed to that before. So there's sort of those natural structures where we want school to be safe for all, which I think it's important. And I know that we talked about this at the workshop of censorship and what students can and cannot see. And I think that that's important sometimes, whether culturally, not pushing people into a danger zone of being able to expose stuff. So I think there's a gentle push and pull that is hard to gauge success and struggle. And so I think even bell schedules or anything can make a conversation have to stop when you don't want it to. So I think one of the things that allows us to be successful is to talk about that, to when something gets blocked on YouTube, be like, well, why is that? Why does the district not want you to see that? Or, yeah, this conversation has to stop. How do we end up getting back to it? And so trying to create the teacher role as more of a facilitator allows us to create the environment where kids can ask questions and kids can think critically beyond just what we traditionally have done for them.
Yeah, I think you've named a couple of really critical pieces there, and I can imagine as well I don't know what it's like in your school context, but it seems throughout the country and conversations with so many teachers, they're faced with so many requirements that I think at times when I've been in conversation with teachers, they see the notion of like media making or leveraging popular culture as being something additional versus what is at the heart of learning for young people. So I didn't know if you had thoughts to add, Paul, as well.
Sure. I think on that point, Paul and Sarah Beth, I think I try to when I'm planning to be use these words momentous and responsive. And so to consider that I have no idea what it's like to be an adolescent in 2014 and plan from that space that I don't know. And yet here is their culture, here's their pop culture, here's everything that's going on in their world. How can I deliver what I'm trying to deliver to them in the context of an adolescent in 2014? And so like I try to be momentous, which what is happening right now in culture and even in the world. In a sense, I think of my students as sort of a hive that I will be launching onto a world in 20 years from now. We're raising policymakers of 2035, if you will, and so what do I want them to be thinking? Which, again, like that far outweighs some kind of ACT prep, I mean, we can do that, but it's so much more important. And in a world where we can watch videos on whatever you want to, and I mean, I have images of a man being beheaded in my mind right now. I have that's a really sad thing happened at our high school last week. A freshman boy beat up a girl, and we've been on the news. We were just on the news at 6 o'clock. I missed it, but I'll be able to pull up the video. Our high school for this young man. The media locally has been almost camping out at our school doing these news reports about violence at my high school, and that's not who goes there. And so I have this. I can pull up on my projector for my English classes the video of what local media does, a 1.5-minute news report, and then I can show them the comments section of that report, and show them what the masses are thinking about this one thing. And it's so necessary. It's to have them insightful about, when I grew up watching Tom Brokaw, it was this nice polished little news report, and you didn't get to know what America thought about that. Now you get to know, and I don't know, there's so much truth out there. So I'll stop there.
A little bit of a follow-up for Paul. Like, I love what you said about kind of trying to think about what's the experience of an adolescent in 2014, and that's something that I actually struggle with in my own teaching at the college level. I feel like at some point, like, my cultural references totally diverged from the students that I was teaching. So, like, how do you, in thinking about integrating popular culture, particularly in the classroom, I mean, how do you kind of gauge where your students are at, and like how to meet them where they live?
So it's part that, so it's part that momentous thing, that being responsive to the culture writ large, and then to think about who's sitting in my classroom. That's not so much about me understanding what they want, but first chiseling away at what we all go through. The human experience is the same for us sitting here and our young people. And so I think I spend the first part of the year, or at least these last 3 years, I feel like I have, at this idea that you are, and this is deeper than maybe this conversation, but it's that we are all this thing that arrives on this planet, and then and we're basically good at heart, and then things happen, and you start to defend yourselves from the things that happen. And I use characters from books to teach that aspect, and that at the heart of this, of everything that we, I have to come at it from a human aspect, and try to get at the very basic things of what makes people behave the way they do. And so then I can study characters from books that way, and I can pick apart arguments in the classroom that way, and back things up. I mean, if you trace every rough behavior, every undesirable behavior back, there's usually an insecurity, there's usually a fear, there's usually some kind of defense up, and it's this little set of things that are the reason why human beings act the way they do. Whether it's a kid in my classroom or it's Adolf Hitler, it's like you can trace it back. So I wouldn't say that I put my finger on, I'm not out listening to hip-hop music all day long so that I can study what my kids are listening to. I don't think it's that space as much as it is the human space that's common for all of us. And I think through language, a teacher with a carefully crafted language can bring kids to the heart of the thing. So.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Okay.
I love thinking about how you privilege the idea of like the human condition over, knowing what the kids are doing these days, or whatever, what the kids are listening to these days.
Yeah, because I don't want to listen to that.
To what Paul said?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I think the idea of connecting the character to kind of what's going on in the world around is good too. As teachers, we have this curriculum, and we're supposed to see this scope and sequence across the year. So there's a pressure to sort of keep going. And just the other day, we're reading Speak, which I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the novel, but it's about a freshman girl who loses her voice because she's assaulted the summer before her freshman year. And I'm teaching freshmen, so it feels really raw to kind of be going through this experience with them. And so we pulled in some media. We looked at a TED Talk by Niara Vijayan. I'm probably mispronouncing her name, but she's talking about gender violence in India. And then we pulled in a New York Times opinion article about Ray Rice. And it made me nervous as a teacher, like, okay, we're opening up this dialogue, but at the same time, that's what's going on in the world around them. And giving them an opportunity to talk about it, they came up with great questions of, why isn't the government doing anything? Or why are we not talking about violence against males? And those questions allowed them to go back in the book and I think understand, the main character better and also themselves to try to process it. And, even though it was really risky to do that, I had a student come up afterwards and give me the feedback, of that felt real. And I think that that's what Paul's sort of talking about is you don't necessarily have to go and, be hanging out with the youth culture, even though I really like listening to the hip hop, so that's something that I can connect with them about. But that idea of you can't ignore what's going on in the community just for the sake of literature, because that is the human experience. And so allowing them to connect both elements makes the classroom feel important and valuable, because then hopefully they go home and talk about it and can process it even further.
So can I just jump in with a follow-up question about the risk? You were saying it felt risky, or it was kind of, you were uncertain about it. Like, can you explain, because that's really helpful for us to understand as well on the USC side, like what that risk is for you by bringing in media like that?
I think you really have to have a lot of trust with your administrator, because I'm in a new school this year, and one of the things I had dialogue about with my administrator is how open is the classroom, and what is this population like, and talk to me about the culture of the school, because I think if you don't have the support by the other people in your building, then it's more challenging, because a lot can happen within the classroom where you can navigate a conversation or you can show multiple sides, but then when they leave the classroom, the students have their own interpretation of what happened. And so that open dialogue with other teachers in the building, for example, before I showed the TED Talk or showed the Ray Rice article, all the freshman teachers, we talked about it. Okay, are our kids ready for this? They're 14. Do we show them this and talk about violence, or do we want to protect these young kids and not have them have to wrestle with such hard things that are going on in the world? So I think that risk is good. We talk in my classroom about getting outside of your comfort zone, but not pushing yourself into the danger zone where you shut down. I did have a girl in class that was like, hey, I can't read this article, about the Ray Rice situation. I said, okay, here's another article. And I don't need to know why or why you don't want to read it, but you're making a choice. And so, therefore, I think every human being deserves that, of not being pushed too far outside their comfort zones. So there's disclaimers involved, but at the same time, I don't want them to be blind to it. And that's where I have to have the support. And then I keep my fingers crossed that there's not an angry parent phone call, or that I'm not pulled into the principal's office and be like, you shouldn't be doing this, because I do feel like it's so valuable. So if I can defend the reason behind why I'm doing it, then I have the courage to actually bring it in the classroom.
That's great. This is just such a powerful conversation, thinking about all these nuances in your practice. And I'm wondering, now that we've gotten a chance to hear you, both of you, Sarah Beth and Paul, talk about your practice and how you think about these different elements with regard to the young people you work with, I'm wondering if we could put this together a little bit and think about the MAPP workshop or your MAPP experience from the summer and your work with Scalar. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you could imagine using Scalar or using the resources that you were presented with this summer in your own classrooms.
So maybe, if it's okay, I'm just going to jump in really quickly to provide a little context of what, from the MAPP perspective, what we were trying to do over the summer, and that'd be great to hear how it matched up with the experiences on the other end.
Yeah, thanks, Amy.
Yeah. So we were, as Gabe mentioned and as Gabe explained, we had developed these resources that he walked through, and at the beginning of around May, I think, we were starting to feel very uncertain about what we were developing, and we weren't sure how what we had envisioned a way that these resources could be used, and but we weren't sure how they would be used. So we really wanted to kind of calibrate and get a sense of what would make sense in educational contexts and even in activist contexts, but more so in educational contexts. And that is when we established this relationship with the National Writing Project to really reach out to teachers and just bring them Scalar as a work in progress, as it is, and get a sense of what resonates, what doesn't, what would be useful for you, for teachers, for educators in classrooms, how could they use it, what would they need to help them scaffold and more, that kind of thing. And it's great that we have representatives from both cities, because we went to Kansas City and then we went to Portland later in the summer. So that's kind of the context for that.
Great, thanks, Sangeeta. And I'm wondering if Paul or Sarah Beth, if you'd like to jump in and talk a little bit about the way you've been thinking about Scalar and the possibilities in your classroom.
Sure. While I was at the workshop, my mind was racing with all sorts of ways to mess with Scalar in the classroom, and I think I see it how it's kind of hanging out in my mind is a forum, and I like to I visit it, and it's pretty easy to navigate. So it's a great brainstorming tool for all sorts of ideas, and I have this idea that there's this generation, when we stop and think about truth, it's like this big mass of twine, and so it's all this truth that we have out there is connected, and it's messy, and so I feel like Scalar, as it's being further developed, is sort of like the big messy truth, and there's little bits of it that are labeled so that I can go find the right inch of twine that I'm looking for. And I don't mean to be so metaphorical there, but I think it works. I think it functions as a great forum for my thoughts, in a way, for me to go through and navigate. And using it in my classroom, I among many things, I have it sort of thinking the same way, to not bring just my fifth hour together, but in the long term. And I have mentioned it to schools across the city that I work with, in conversations, but to have this common ground for a school 15 miles away from here that we can sort of operate together, and I think it provides an ideal platform for that, so those conversations can be initiated. So.
And I would say conversations is I guess it acted as a catalyst for me, and to trigger more conversations, because it was in the summer, and for 48 hours my mind was just racing, as Paul was talking about. Mm-hmm. And I kept sending videos to my teacher friends and being like, "Oh, we could do this," or "Oh, we could do that." Just even talking to my administrators about, "Look at this video put on by youth about sex ed. Is there a place for that in our curriculum?" And just allowing us to talk about it as teachers first, especially because some of the material other people at the workshop were concerned might not be school appropriate for middle schoolers or high schoolers. And so really just looking through the resource over the workshop was really helpful, and getting to spend a day talking about what we would want to include. I haven't had the opportunity to necessarily use it in the classroom quite yet, but I do have it mapped out where we're going to look at some of the material and talk about youth media, and then figure out how we can create our own. And ideally, if you guys go that direction, I know we talked about at the workshop of how can the format become more collaborative with schools. Can we submit videos for you guys? Could we put workshops on there that we've done? Is there a place for youth to have some choice about what material goes up there. So I think all of those questions came up over the workshop, and that was what was really exciting, is that you guys have created a space to put this material and open up conversation. So not only is it a catalyst, but it's collaborative, and I'm just excited to see where it goes over this year and report back to you guys how we've used it, because you just have such an expansive list of things that are important in public education.
I have another follow-up question. I'm totally taking over Paul's job here. But one of the things we've been thinking about is, you know, when this grew out of the book project, as Sangeeta said, we wanted to look at the connections between popular culture and civics. So there was sort of this explicit political or civic dimension in what existed there in the very beginning, but you know, it's blossomed, it's branched out into this very expansive, you know, set of resources. And I think we're curious to see, and Paul and Sarah Beth are both, you know, language arts English teachers, how usable it is across disciplines and for teachers in a variety of, you know, who teach a variety of different subject matters. So I guess my question is how you think Scalar might spark a discussion of politics, I guess broadly defined, or whether or not you see that as kind of, you know, something that you would do, you know, in your English classroom. So that makes sense.
And if I could just add to that, and first of all, let me just say, Leanna, you can always have my job. I'm totally happy to give that up. But coincidentally, I was going to ask a similar kind of question. So let me just tack mine on, which is, I'm involved in a project in Oakland that really does focus on civics and actually digital civics. So the question I was going to ask had to do with activism and the degree to which you saw the resources at Scalar as being something that resonates with your notion of the kinds of activism that you want to engage your young people in, and whether that's even part of the equation at all, this notion of activism. And I ask this because in the work with the teachers in Oakland, I think they're challenged by, and you know, they definitely want their young people to be empowered and to be civically engaged, but I think they're challenged by some of the issues around like the media production pieces in relation to like digital civics. So I think this is, you know, going back to Leanna's question, but as well thinking about you know, how you see, I guess how you see the relationship between how you might use Scalar and your notions of activism, you know, particularly in a digital context, you know, today.
Yeah, so I mean, I see it as activism. I see storytelling as an act. I see sharing of truth as an act of activism, you know. And I remember, you know, a few years ago when Occupy Wall Street was having you know, getting a lot of airplay, and I believe it was a Daily Show that did this segment that showed the, you know, the activists having, you know, some folks from Wall Street were pouring champagne on the activists down below them, and I made up my mind then that would not be the kind of activism that I would participate in, and I think it has its place to bring attention to a matter, to crowd people outside of a place where something is happening, but it's not the kind of activism that I want to participate in. And there's, you know, the digital media, and I haven't practiced it enough. I think I make iMovies, we publish them, but I think there's a far greater opportunity to have a forum where stories are being told. And I talk about this often, so if I stay in this space, it's because I believe in it. But I mean, it's very simple that we're a judgmental creature, and if your brain wants to make sense of a black person across the street, you're going to categorize them as the black person across the street. And as soon as you walk across the street and the black person tells a story, one story about themselves, they are no longer in that category. They have now stepped out of that category as you had it, and now you have a story about them, and now they're an individual. And so, like, this idea of storytelling, and if it's going to happen on a scale that alters culture, that alters civilization, then it's to make it digital, put it out there for as many people to see. That's such a simplified answer, but the impact of that is immeasurable, I think. So I don't know. I don't have a whole lot more to say about that, but the idea of telling stories across these chasms it changes everything. And digitally, if we think about that, then let's do that, you know.
I want to say word to everything Paul said about truth and storytelling and activism, because I think that's what I try to preach and teach to students in my classroom. I have developed this Modern Voices curriculum where we look at the truth tellers who have come before us. So whether it's, you know, musicians or poets or speechwriters or politicians, and the students get time to explore and learn about what those voices look like and what the strategies look like and the techniques. And so whether it's looking at media or reading text, they get to understand who are the people who have shaped our culture and gotten us to where we are today. And then at the end of the unit, the final is all about, well, okay, now you know what to do. What are you going to do? And they have to pick a project and design something that they are passionate about, whether it's just something like opening up and telling their own story. So students have done something to the extent of being truthful to their class that they are an undocumented citizen, and what that has allowed them to do by having the power to say it. And then, okay, how am I going to connect with my classmates now? How am I going to inspire them to speak out about it? Or something like I had some students who were talking about dating violence, and they created a video, and it brought me to tears just to watch it. But they were sharing their stories, and all of a sudden, the students in their classroom couldn't think about it as something far away. They had to think about, okay, what am I going to do with this now? So whether they're making music or, you know, writing letters to family members, whatever it is, they are being compelled to speak up. And I think that that's what witnessing media that's come before you, like you guys have some great, you know, fun political music videos on Scalar, and they're great. And students can see that and be like, oh, there's a kid like me making something that tons of people are watching. You know, what is that selfie culture that they are used to going to actually do, and how is it going to inspire other people? So I think that this is a great place for us to start in activism, is what has gotten you to act, and then what are you going to do about it?
Great, thanks. And speaking of storytelling and activism, Sangeeta and the MAPP team were involved in a great series at connectedlearning.tv, and I'm hoping that we can post the link to that series. That was really getting close to the hour. In fact, I think we're at the top of the hour, and I wanted to, before we go and close out, just give Gabe and Leanna and Sangeeta an opportunity for a quick thought, final thought, based on this far-ranging conversation. So let's start with you, Gabe.
Yeah, I mean, mostly I'm just really struck and reminded of, you know, in this sort of messy, sometimes overwhelming landscape, the clarity, concrete immediacy that comes from really thinking about it from the perspective of an educator engaging with real students in the classroom. And, you know, yes, these practices exist in the world, they're embedded in our social lives, but to reflect on them in a place where we're all coming together to learn is just such a powerful aspect to all of this, that I really just want to say thank you for sharing those thoughts and giving us the chance to engage in this work through that lens, because it is such a big goal of our work, and this particular venue has been really useful to work ideas, and I just really appreciate the dialogue. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Great, thanks, Gabe. Leanna?
I'm just going to, sorry, I was just going, because he's ended on dialogue, so I have a very brief comment. You said that, Scalar, I'm really struck by your thoughts that Scalar is kind of a place that encourages conversation, or I love the metaphor, by the way, of the yarn and of the threads, and it just really inspired me to try and think about even more ways that we can encourage those conversations, and this being one of those. Being part of it, and thank you for reinforcing that in my mind about the Scalar project.
I'm seeing the exact same thing. It's like, ooh, that's a great task to take away from this.
Wonderful. And Leanna?
Well, I mean, Gabe and Sagita stole my thunder when they thanked you for your time. It's been a great conversation, and I've loved hearing your thoughts, both on Scalar, but about sort of weaving these practices into the classroom. When we saw you, when we met you during the summer, it was the summer, and now you're in the thick of it. And so I think it's been really cool to kind of hear about what your experiences are now, and particularly, as Paul said, we participated in this DML or connected learning webinar that was about storytelling, but I feel like I have so many new little kernels to think about now in relationship to how I've been thinking about storytelling for the past several months. So thanks. We love having this conversation, so it's been great.
Great, and I can say that I've loved being in conversation with all of you. I really appreciate you all as guests. I think as well our audience. We appreciate you too. Before we say goodbye, I'll just give a quick shout out to to Connected Learning. So thank you, Leanna, for that transitional phrase. If you are interested in learning more about Connected Learning, please make sure to check out the Connected Learning Alliance at clalliance.org, where there are tremendous testimonials from practitioners and informative multimedia pieces. And if you'd like to keep abreast of future opportunities from Educator Innovator and partners like our friends at MAPP, please sign up today for the monthly newsletter at educatorinnovator.org and follow Educator Innovator on Twitter at innovates_ed. Thanks, everyone, and good night.